Good morning. Today is the 16th day of Behar, the 24th of May. This is the last day of the week for Parashat Behar, and we'll sort of be summing it up, 5th, 6th, and 7th readings. It's a very important commentary by Rashi on the second to last verse in the Parsha. Actually not second to last, third to last. And this is in Leviticus 25, verse 55. The verse reads, it seems to have nothing to do with what we're going to be talking about. And there's a question about why it's here, but the simple answer would be because this is the end of the Parsha, so Rashi is going to sum up a lot of what we've seen, and he's going to put it all together. We already mentioned this, I believe, on Wednesday. We said that there's 3 mentions of the words V'chi amuch achicha, that your brother should become destitute. So the verses, it is the second to last one. It's 26:1. It's Leviticus 26:1. You must not make idols for yourselves, nor may you set up for yourselves a sculpted image, or a single stone monument, which was at that time worshipped as an idol. You must not lay a pavement of stones on which to prostrate yourselves in your land, for I am Havaya, your God. Now, Rashi, on this verse, on the beginning of it, he gives us the following explanation. He says, this command, meaning to not make idols, which has been stated earlier, we've had all these prohibitions have been stated already in Exodus and earlier in Leviticus. So he says they are repeated here to address an individual who has sold himself as a servant to a non-Jew. This is something that we would have seen yesterday, that a person sells himself. This is the 6th reading. The person, when he's so destitute that he doesn't have any way to survive, he can sell himself into servitude. We talked about this actually on Wednesday, on the 4th reading, and there I mentioned that there are actual repercussions or relevant laws, halachos, that relate to this today. And I looked it up again afterwards. I was talking from memory. It's much more serious than what I thought. I said that the Torah frowns upon making a contract, a working contract, meaning that I'm making a contract with my employer for more than 3 years. In fact, there are some opinions, and in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Law, the simple understanding is that you can't make it for more than 3 years. You can't sign a contract for more than 3 years. I said there that it's only if you live by your employer, but I looked it up again, and it seems that it's any kind of contract. A person should not be bound to a contract for more than 3 years. It's considered a form of servitude. I once knew someone who told me that regardless of, contracts are really renewed every year. That's really at least that's the way that it's done in Israel. I'm not sure how it's done in the United States. Employment contracts. But someone told me that every 5 years they make it a point to leave the job that they're at and go to a different job, because they really said that if you're at a job for too long, you stagnate and you can't really continue to progress. And the whole point of life should be to be moving forward. So if you've been at a job for too long, you're really not moving anywhere, and you tend to calcify and turn into one of those monuments. In any case, so this person, he sold himself as a servant to a non-Jew. So says Rashi, he should not say, since my master is a liberal. He's not one of these non-Jews who worships idols. Or at least he doesn't seem to really believe in it. He just does it because that's his custom. So you should not say, since my master is a liberal, I will be like him. Since my master worships idols, I will be like him. Since my master desecrates the Sabbath, I will be like him. And indeed, So this is the warning here, that if you've fallen down, destitute so far down that you've had to sell yourself into servitude, be careful not to follow your employer, your master here in this case, since it's servitude. Says Rashi, indeed all these sections in our parsha are stated chronologically, following the sequence in which the incidents to which they refer actually occur. And now listen to how Rashi sees the last 3 readings of our parsha, or maybe in the last 4. First, the Torah prohibits us from trading the produce of the sabbatical year. This was at the beginning of our parsha, actually. The sabbatical year, we said that fruit grows, trees continue to give fruit, even fields continue to produce produce. It's just that you're not allowed to trade in it. It's not yours. You need to leave it for anyone who wants to take it. But if a person covets money and becomes suspicious, he falls under the suspicion that he is trading in the sabbatical produce. Meaning, it's not even if he did. It's just others are suspicious of him because he's acting strangely around his field. He will eventually have to sell his possessions. Why the Torah continues with the verse, and when you sell something. That was, we didn't talk about this, but this is Leviticus 25:14, earlier in our parsha. Or purchase something. And here it's hinting to the fact that a possession that is transferred from hand to hand, meaning that he's going to be selling his possessions. That's the first level of falling down. So the first level really is trading in produce of the sabbatical year. The second level is having to sell your possessions. The next level is, if he still does not retract, he will eventually have to sell his home. If he still does not retract, he will eventually have to borrow money with interest. The later the scenario in this passage, the more severe it is. We'll ask about something about this in a moment. If he still does not retract, he will eventually have to sell himself first to his fellow Jew as a servant. These are verses 39 through 46 in chapter 25. And if he is still not repented, he will have to sell himself to a non-Jew into servitude. Okay, so this is what Rashi tells us. He says, everything we just learned is actually an order of descent. It's a sequence of events that starts with coveting money and therefore wanting to trade in the produce of the sabbatical year, something that we're prohibited from doing. So now, let's look at this a little bit. So first of all, this reminds us of leprosy that we talked about a few weeks ago. There we also saw a certain order of descent, one would call it. If someone spoke lashon hara, slander, the leprosy, the plague, the tzarat, would come upon his house. If he did not repent, the plague would come upon his clothing. And if he did not repent, it would come upon his body. And there the order, according to the sages' interpretation, not according to the order of the verses. The order of the verses is the opposite. But the sages say that the order is first your home, then your possessions, your clothing, and then finally your body. So this is a different order indeed, because it goes from house to clothing to the person himself. In our parsha, in Behar, the descent is from possessions, estate, meaning the land that I have, inherited land, house, then borrowing with interest, then selling oneself to an Israelite, and then finally selling oneself to a non-Jew. So what's the idea? Why is the order so different? So the simplest explanation is because by leprosy, the whole point is that the more severe it is, the closer it is to your body. So it starts out in the home, then it moves to the clothing, and finally it comes directly onto the body itself. But here we're talking about the loss of assets, and the loss of assets goes by their value and necessity. So you start out with your simple possessions, which we will see as clothing, and eventually it comes all the way down to yourself, your freedom, which is your most coveted possession. And by having to sell yourself into servitude, that is the loss of freedom. So altogether we have 7 stages of decline here. So let's look at these 7 stages, and the way we make order of these things. Again, Rashi is, and you can't always remember, there's a lot of details here. So the way that we remember these things is we take what we've just learned and we correspond it to another model that we know much better. And the other model is, of course, the 7 attributes of the heart, from loving kindness to kingdom. So let's see. So the sabbatical year, not keeping the sabbatical year, trading in the fruit of the sabbatical year is loving kindness. Now, why would it be loving kindness? Well, the simplest answer is, that the whole point of the sabbatical year is a kindness to the land. It's to allow it to flourish, to let it rest. But it's also a tremendous kindness to the poor and to the animals, because I'm not allowed to trade in the produce, not the fruit or the produce of the field. So these things, they all go to the poor people, and they go to the animals. The Torah specifically says this. The produce of the field that comes out by itself on the 7th year, you should leave it for the animals. You shouldn't use it to trade. So that's the loving kindness. That's the first thing. That's where the blemish is. And what does this also mean? It means that the first thing that's blemished in a person, when they're on their way down to destitution, when they're on their way down to losing their assets, is when they don't act with kindness to others, when they stop giving charity, when they stop being interested in the well-being of others. The moment that you stop this, the moment that there's a blemish in this, this will lead eventually to this whole sequence of losing one's assets. Now, the second stage, selling one's possessions, is might, what we call gevura. And it's because he coveted money that he didn't keep the sabbatical year. And his possessions, specifically one's clothing, is one's might. It's one's power. Because we know that, again, this is going from my least important assets, let's call them. Assets I can change. They're more external. But the way that a person dresses, the way that he shows himself in public, that is a symbol of his status, of his power. So when I have to sell my possessions, what I'm doing is I'm losing my might. I'm losing my strength, my gevura, my feeling that I'm a man. I'm losing that. It's not, let's say better, it's my manliness. It's not necessarily my power inside. It's more my clout, the way that I'm seen by society. The third stage it goes together with the fourth. So first one sells one's landed estate, and then one sells one's house. The landed estate, we already talked about in the 4th reading. We said that this is the aggrandizement of man. We lean and depend on our land because that's what gives us security in our lives. And so we aggrandize ourselves. There's even a verse that says, Ki tiferet adam lashevet bait. The beauty or the aggrandizement of man is through his real estate, through his estate. This is, as we said, this is why the Torah says, never sell all of your land. You always have to retain something. You can't go through life without having an estate. And then the home is already what we call victory, netzach, the 4th attribute of the heart. And the reason for this is, and we mentioned this also when we were talking about the estate and the home, that you need a home in order to have a family. And netzach literally means victory, but it also means eternity. So netzach is always the continuation of the generations. It's my ability to raise a family. I need to have a house, a home, to raise a family. So if I have to sell my home, then what I'm losing is my security in raising my children. Now we come to the 5th stage. The 5th stage is that you will borrow with interest. Rashi told us that every stage is worse than the previous one. Now somebody says, why is borrowing with interest so much worse than selling your estate, your land, or your home. It would seem that those are much worse than having to borrow with interest. Again, borrowing with interest is a prohibition in the Torah. You're not allowed to either borrow money to people or to borrow money from people, or even to be an intermediary in such an exchange if there is interest involved. And these laws are very, very complex. What constitutes interest? But in any case, why would this be so grave, so difficult? The answer is because when you begin to borrow with interest, notice, in the first stage, what was wrong was that the person didn't keep the prohibition of trading the produce of the sabbatical year. But the second, third, and fourth stages were not prohibitions. They were just not good advice. Don't sell these assets. But when we come to the fifth stage, the person is forced to borrow with interest. He's forced to go against the Torah and do something that's very difficult. But this something is not just anything. This something, sages say that people who borrow with interest do not have a portion. Their bodies do not rise in the resurrection of the dead. Why is this? This is one of the gravest sins in the Torah. It's very interesting. Today, if you live outside the land of Israel, it's probably permissible because the banks are not held by Jews. They're publicly owned. If it's a private bank like Safra, I don't know what you do, because that's a private bank that's held by Jews. You're not allowed to borrow with interest or to give them interest. In Israel, what we do is, since all the banks are held publicly by Jews, so we have a special contract that we make when opening any account that the interest is not interest. It's legalized in such a way that it's actually part of the profits. And there's a way to do this to get around the problem of interest. There's many people who don't want to do this even, so they don't really have a bank account in the usual sense. But getting back to this, why is this so terrible to borrow with interest? Borrowing with interest means that someone is paying you for time, not for the money that they're using. They're paying you for the time that the money is by them, and they're using it for whatever purpose. To sell time is something that a person should not be able to do. And if he does, the prohibition is not to sell your time, not to sell time in this sense. You're supposed to give a loan because you're doing charity, because you're helping the person, not trying to make money from it. So, if you are selling your time, say the sages, in the same way, God will be selling your time. So you are supposed to have X amount of years after the resurrection of the dead, infinite maybe years, whatever it is, but you've lost some of that. You've sold your time, so you've sold some of the eternity that comes after the resurrection of the dead. In any case, what does this do? This is a form of death. And who is the dealer of death in the world? That's the primordial snake. And so when a person is borrowing with interest, even borrowing, again, because he's destitute, he needs the money, borrowing with interest causes him to open himself up to the snake. This is known as the blemish of Hod, the fifth attribute of the heart, the attribute that we also correspond many times to the immune system. The immune system is what keeps us safe. And when you do this prohibition of borrowing with interest, what you're doing is you're opening yourself up spiritually to the snake. That's why this is more grave than the previous three levels. And this will leaves the person in a state that's called my glory or my acknowledgement. My Hod has churned to ruin. So that's why Rashi says that this is much worse. So we've done 5 stages. We have a couple more to go. We'll do them together. Then we have the 6th and 7th stages. These correspond to foundation and to kingdom. The greatest flaw is when a person sells himself. So first he sells himself as a Hebrew servant. What that means is he gives up his freedom. Foundation is the power of life in the person. It's even called the living organ. It's the one organ that changes all the time. It physically it's different, and it gives life. It's where we give life from. And it's not just the male reproductive organ, it's the female reproductive organ also. So if a person gives up on his freedom, it's like he's giving up on his life force. And that is a blemish in the covenant of foundation. But that's only if he sells himself to a Jew. He's still keeping the foundation. He's still within the tribe, as it were. But at the next stage, he sells himself to a Gentile, to a non-Jew. And this is already a flaw in what we call the crown of foundation, which is also the root of kingdom. They're both in foundation, but one is the foundation itself, the other one is the crown of foundation. And these two stages, they correspond to the circumcision. And if a person, the reason that we circumcise is to get rid of the concealed evil in the heart. When a person, and this is what Rashi started with, that if a person sells his freedom, he will begin to mimic others. He will begin to take in concealed evil that he doesn't even know where it came from. Some of it comes from Jews, and some of it comes from non-Jews. In the Tanya, it has different names, Shedin Yudain, Shedin Nuchain, without getting into that. But they affect the person, and they change his character. And so these are the flaws of foundation and kingdom, which are the worst. And again, the whole point here is to go back to the start. That to keep ourselves from becoming destitute, which is actually a moral descent, we have to start by strengthening our attribute of loving kindness. Like Abraham, who began to shine, as the prophet Ezekiel says, Mi he'ir mi mizrach, who started shining in the east. How did he shine? By his loving kindness. He's the man of loving kindness. Abraham is the archetypal soul of loving kindness. So when we strengthen our loving kindness, our chesed, that's how we prevent ourselves from falling into these 6 additional stages of destitution, which again starts as physical destitution, but ends up being very spiritual destitution. Thank you for joining today. It was a little bit longer than usual. I hope it was worth it. And I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos. And on Sunday, we hopefully will be on the regular hour, even though Sunday is Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, and traditionally celebrated as the day of passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the source from which the writings of the Zohar came. And it's a very big and important day. Hopefully we'll be able to talk and connect the beginning of next week's Parsha with the Zohar also. All the best. Bye-bye.